The night was quiet at the convent of San Giovanni Rotondo, but inside Padre Pio's heart a growing restlessness stirred. In recent times he had heard so many confessions of suffering, so many accounts of hunger and rejection, that he felt a heavy burden on his shoulders. He knew about the poverty of the world, but did he really understand it? He saw the needy every day, yet always from the other side of the confessional. Did he know what it was like to be one of them? In his prayers, he asked for a sign from God to show him how he could best serve the abandoned. And then, in the deepest silence of the early morning, an inspiration touched his soul. The next morning, he made an unexpected decision. He would dress like a beggar and walk the streets, living the contempt that so many suffered daily. He knew that this experience might bring him pain and humiliation, but he also knew that only by feeling the abandonment of the poor in his flesh could he truly understand them. And so, without telling anyone, he exchanged his Franciscan habit for old, dirty clothes, covered his hands with dust and set off. For the first time in years, he left the convent not as a priest, but as an ordinary man. The first shock came quickly. Before, people had sought him out with devotion, yearning for his blessings. Now they averted their eyes, ignoring his presence. Some ladies who would normally ask him for prayers passed him by as if he were invisible. A merchant who had so many times donated supplies to the convent frowned and clutched his bag more tightly upon seeing him approach. Padre Pio felt for the first time the weight of human contempt. As he walked the streets of San Giovanni Rotondo, hunger began to gnaw at him. He noticed the smell of fresh bread coming from a small bakery and for a moment hesitated. Inside, he had been warmly received many times as a priest. But how would he be treated now? With his heart racing, he entered the establishment, ready to live the reality of those who have nothing. Was charity merely a virtue in words, or was there still true kindness in the world? Before he could reach the counter, a suspicious look fell upon him. The attendant scrutinized him from head to toe and frowned. "Would you like something?" His tone was not welcoming. Padre Pio took a deep breath and replied humbly, "A piece of bread, please." It was then that he realized that this simple phrase could change the course of his experience. The attendant looked at Padre Pio with distrust, as if his presence there were an inconvenience. The silence in the room became heavy, laden with judgment. Some customers stopped talking and cast furtive glances in the direction of the disguised friar. He was already familiar with that kind of look, not one of compassion, but of repulsion. After a long moment, the attendant crossed his arms and replied coldly, "We don't give anything away for free here. If you can't pay, look elsewhere." The words hit Padre Pio like a blow. That man, who so many times had donated bread to the convent, was now denying him a simple piece, all because he was seen as a pauper. The friar felt firsthand what so many poor people face daily. It wasn't just hunger that consumed them, but indifference. But before he could leave, a voice rose in the middle of the room. "I'll pay for his bread." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Angelo, a young employee of the bakery. His uniform was slightly dusted with flour, and his face showed a mix of determination and kindness. He took a fresh loaf of bread and placed it on the counter, along with a glass of water. The attendant mumbled something inaudible, but did not stop the young man's action. Padre Pio looked at him with silent gratitude. There was there a pure heart, a spirit different from that of the others. Padre Pio took the bread with trembling hands, not out of hunger, but out of emotion. In that moment, he realized that God had shown him something valuable. Even amidst the coldness of the world, there were still kind souls. He sat in a discreet corner of the bakery, feeling the uncomfortable stares upon him. But his focus was now elsewhere. Who was that young man? What made him act so differently from the others? While eating in silence, he watched Angelo continue his work. The young man expected no recognition, demanded no gratitude. He simply did what he felt was right. Padre Pio knew that his experience was just beginning, but something told him that this encounter was no accident. That young man was a crucial piece in what God wanted to show him. As Padre Pio ate his bread quietly in a corner of the bakery, the eyes of judgment still weighed upon him. Some people murmured among themselves, disapproving of the fact that a beggar was there. A man in a suit who was having coffee near the counter muttered to his companion, "That's why these kinds of people never improve. There's always someone willing to give things away for free." The words pierced the silence like a sharp knife. Is this really how the poor were seen? Like a burden, a problem to be avoided? The attendant, still visibly annoyed by Padre Pio's presence, wiped the counter with exaggerated force, as if trying to erase any trace of him from there. This will only bring more people like him here. The friar remained silent, but inside he felt a deep sadness. He had heard many confessions of arrogance and hardness of heart, but now he saw the evil of indifference displayed before his eyes. On the other hand, Angelo showed no remorse whatsoever. He continued his work normally, not letting the tense atmosphere shake him. When he noticed that Padre Pio's bread had run out, he discreetly took another piece and placed it on the friar's plate. The simple gesture, yet full of meaning, warmed Padre Pio's heart. In such a cold world, there were still those who would extend a hand without expecting anything in return, but not everyone saw it in a positive light. The door of the bakery opened abruptly, and Regina, the manager of the establishment, entered with an expression of displeasure. Her eyes went straight to Angelo, and then to Padre Pio, who was still seated. She frowned and crossed her arms, her tone laced with irritation. "Angelo, what is happening here? Why is that man still sitting in my bakery?" Padre Pio took a deep breath. He knew that this moment would reveal more than just the simple rules of a business. It would show the true heart of people. The young Angelo would now face a trial, and Padre Pio wanted to see how he would react. Regina walked briskly towards Angelo, her gaze heavy with discontent. "I want an explanation. Now." The tone of her voice left no room for discussion. Angelo, however, did not back down. "He only wanted a piece of bread, and I gave it. What's the problem with that?" The ensuing silence made the atmosphere even tenser. Some customers watched the scene with interest, others lowered their heads, pretending nothing was happening. Regina let out an ironic laugh and shook her head. "The problem, Angelo, is that this is a business, not a charity. Do you think you can simply feed anyone who comes in asking for alms? Tomorrow, there will be a line of beggars at the door." Her gaze was cold, unyielding. "If he can't pay, then he has no right to be here." The words struck Padre Pio like a blow to the chest. That speech was exactly what he feared to find, a world where the value of a human being was measured by appearance or financial condition. But he remained silent, simply observing. He wanted to see how far Angelo would go, whether his kindness was just a fleeting impulse or truly something rooted in his soul. Angelo took a deep breath before answering. "I'd rather be fired than pretend I didn't see someone hungry in front of me." His voice was firm, without hesitation. "If this piece of bread is a problem for the bakery, I'll pay for it. But I do not regret what I did." For a moment, Regina was speechless. The attendant next to her widened his eyes, as if he could not believe what he had just heard. The silence in the bakery was almost deafening. Padre Pio felt a shiver run through his body. Angelo was willing to lose everything for an act of compassion. How many people would have that courage? He knew that this young man had something special, something that God intended to use for a greater purpose. But Angelo still did not realize it. The friar finished his bread in silence, but he had already made up his mind. He needed to do something for that young man. The silence in the bakery remained heavy after Angelo's words. Regina continued to look at him, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "You'd rather be fired? Then perhaps that is exactly what will happen." Her voice was laced with frustration. "People like him don't deserve our bread. Let him go beg for alms at the church." Some people in the bakery nodded discreetly, agreeing with the manager. Others merely looked down, uncomfortable, yet too afraid to intervene. Angelo, however, remained steadfast. He did not raise his voice, did not argue. He merely maintained his determined gaze. If feeding someone who is hungry is a mistake, then I'd rather be mistaken. Regina opened her mouth to reply, but hesitated. There was something about this young man that bothered her, perhaps because deep down she knew that he was right. With a huff, she turned to the other employees. "Get back to work. And you, Angelo, we'll talk about this later." Padre Pio continued to sit, finishing his bread and absorbing every detail of the situation. The scene before him was a living lesson of what he had so often heard in confessions: human selfishness, the coldness of the world, but also the spark of kindness that still survived in some hearts. Angelo wasn't doing it out of pride or challenge. He did it because he felt deep in his soul that it was the right thing to do. When Angelo returned to the counter, he saw that Padre Pio was still watching him. His eyes, though tired, held a depth that the young man could not explain. The friar then asked a simple question, yet laden with intention. "Have you always been like this, always helped those in need?" The young man frowned, a bit surprised by the question. "I don't know. I guess I just do what I would like others to do for me if I were in their place." Padre Pio smiled slightly. He saw in that answer what he needed. There was something special in Angelo, something that the young man himself did not yet understand. But God understood. And that was why their paths had crossed. The young man did not yet know it, but his life was about to change forever. The bustle in the bakery subsided, and Angelo took advantage of a brief pause to approach discreetly the table where Padre Pio was still seated. There was something about that man that intrigued him. It wasn't just the fact that he was a wanderer, but the way he observed everything around him, as if he saw more than what the eyes allowed. There was a serenity about him, a presence that Angelo could not explain. "Do you need anything else?" asked the young man, trying to sound casual. Padre Pio looked up and studied Angelo for a moment, before replying calmly, "Just your story." The answer caught the young man by surprise. He blinked several times, confused. "My story? What is there to tell? I'm just a bakery attendant." Padre Pio smiled gently. "And yet, you did something that few would. Why?" Angelo hesitated, looking at his hands as if seeking the answer there. I think I've always wanted to help others, but I never had much to give." He sighed, seeming reluctant to continue, but something in the friar's gaze encouraged him to speak. "My dream has always been to open a shelter for homeless people, for those without food. But who am I for that? I can barely pay my own bills." Padre Pio felt a tightening in his chest. How many like Angelo had within them a divine calling, yet were held back by the limitations of the world? God placed great desires in men's hearts, but few had the courage to follow them. The friar leaned forward slightly and said something that made Angelo tremble. "If God has placed this desire in your heart, he himself will pave the way." Before Angelo could respond, the bakery door opened once more, and Regina entered in a hurry. Her expression indicated that that brief moment of peace was about to be interrupted. Angelo straightened his posture, preparing for what was to come. Padre Pio, for his part, knew that his mission there was not yet finished. Regina walked briskly to Angelo, her eyes filled with irritation. "Can we talk? Now?" Her tone left no room for refusal. Angelo cast a quick glance at Padre Pio before following the manager to a more secluded corner of the bakery. The friar, attentive, followed the scene in silence. Regina wasted no time. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? Serving beggars for free? Do you think you can turn this bakery into a convent?" Her tone was harsh, impatient. "This is a business, Angelo. If we become known for giving away food for free, people will stop buying. These kinds of people do not deserve pity. They only hinder those who truly work." Angelo felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to argue, to make Regina understand that kindness is never a waste. But deep down, he knew that words alone would not change that mindset. Still, he remained steadfast. "I don't see any problem in helping those in need. I'd rather go hungry than deny bread to someone who has even less than I do." Regina shook her head in disbelief. You've always been stubborn, Angelo, but I'm warning you. If you continue with this, you might as well say goodbye to your job." The young man felt the weight of her threat, but he did not show fear. His heart was already decided. If he had to choose between keeping his job or doing what was right, he would not hesitate. Meanwhile, Padre Pio watched everything carefully. He saw beyond what was happening. He knew that Angelo was being tested not by Regina, but by something greater. And the answer he gave now could change the course of his life forever. Angelo's heart pounded. He knew that his decision could cost him his job, but within him there was an inexplicable peace. Regina looked at him impatiently, expecting him to give in, to apologize, to promise not to repeat the mistake. But Angelo took a deep breath and replied firmly, "If feeding someone who is hungry is a mistake, then I don't want to be right." Regina let out a dry laugh and crossed her arms. "So, you've made your choice then? Very well. You're fired." The ensuing silence was heavy. Some employees stopped what they were doing, shocked. Some customers whispered among themselves, but Angelo was not shaken. He simply nodded, as if he had expected it all along. "If this is the consequence for doing what is right, I accept it." Padre Pio observed everything closely. Angelo had passed the test. His faith was not superficial. It was not merely a fleeting impulse. He was willing to sacrifice everything for what he believed in. The friar smiled slightly, and without saying a word, rose and left the bakery. Angelo watched his departure with his eyes, feeling that that man was more than he appeared to be. Hours later, while still trying to process everything that had happened, Angelo heard a knock on the door of his small home. Upon opening it, he found a friar standing there. "Padre Pio wishes to speak with you." The young man felt a shiver run down his spine. What could that man possibly want from him? Without hesitating, he followed the friar to the convent. His heart was restless, filled with questions. He did not know that, upon passing through those doors, his life would change forever. As he crossed the convent's gates, Angelo felt an invisible weight upon his shoulders. His heart pounded fast, overwhelmed by a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What did Padre Pio want with him? The friar guiding him offered no explanations, only walking calmly along the stone corridors until he stopped before a simple wooden door. "Come in, Padre Pio is waiting." Angelo took a deep breath and entered. As he looked up, his body trembled. Before him, seated calmly, was the very same man who had served bread that morning. But now he was not wearing old dirty clothes. He was dressed in his Franciscan habit, and his gaze was even more penetrating, laden with something Angelo couldn't explain. For a moment, the young man was paralyzed. Words simply failed him. Padre Pio smiled tenderly. "Do you understand now, Angelo?" His voice was calm, but laden with meaning. "You did not serve bread to a beggar today. You served Christ." Angelo felt his legs weaken. A wave of emotions overtook him. How had he never noticed? How had he not recognized the man whom so many spoke of as a living saint? Tears filled his eyes. "Padre, was it you? All along?" His voice came out trembling, laden with disbelief. Padre Pio nodded gently. "God wanted our paths to cross. You think you lost everything today, Angelo, but in truth, you have just gained something much greater." The young man did not know what to say. His heart burned as never before, as if God were speaking directly to him. He felt that his life would never be the same. Angelo's heart pounded unevenly. Padre Pio's words echoed within him, as if God were showing him a new path. The young man tried to speak, but his voice failed him. How could he have imagined that the man to whom he had given bread that morning was one of the holiest men of his time? He did not know whether he should kneel, ask for forgiveness, or simply cry. Padre Pio slowly rose and placed his hand on the young man's shoulder. "You have always wanted to help the poor, haven't you?" Angelo nodded slightly. The friar continued, "God gave you this desire for a reason. You are not alone in this mission. I want you to come work with me here at the convent." The proposal took Angelo by surprise. His eyes widened, not sure if he had heard correctly. Work here? At the convent? But what would I do? I'm not a friar. I don't know anything about the church, about charity on a large scale. Padre Pio smiled. What you have, no one can teach. A heart willing to do good. That is enough. Angelo's eyes filled with tears. All his life he had felt that he should do something greater, but he had never known how. Now, before Padre Pio, he saw that his calling had always been there, waiting only for him to take a step of faith. His dream of helping the poor was not a distant illusion. God was already paving the way. That night, Angelo slept at the convent for the first time. The next day, he began working alongside the friars, distributing food and welcoming the needy. His heart was finally where it had always belonged. And as he watched people coming in search of help, he remembered what Padre Pio had told him. You did not serve bread to a beggar today, you served Christ. Days turned into weeks, and Angelo devoted himself wholeheartedly to the work at the convent. With every meal served, with every embrace given to a needy person, he understood that his mission was far greater than he had imagined. It was not merely about giving bread to the hungry, but about offering dignity, hope, and love. His name began to be known among those who sought shelter, not as a mere helper, but as a true servant of God. News of his transformation reached the bakery. Some colleagues were surprised, others laughed, saying that he had wasted an opportunity. But something unexpected happened. Regina, the manager, appeared at the convent. Her gaze no longer carried the contempt of before, but a different weight. Perhaps remorse. She hesitated before speaking. I came to bring bread for the needy. Padre Pio, watching from a distance, smiled. He knew that something had changed in that woman's heart. Sometimes transformation came from where it was least expected. The simple act by Angelo, which had seemed insignificant that day in the bakery, had planted a seed that was now beginning to bear fruit. One evening, while resting in the convent's courtyard, Angelo heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, he saw Padre Pio standing in the shade of an olive tree, watching him with a deep gaze. The young man smiled. I think I finally understand, Padre. I didn't lose anything that day. I gained everything. The friar nodded, satisfied. When you fed a hungry person, Angelo, you fed Christ himself. At that moment, a gentle breeze blew through the courtyard. Angelo closed his eyes, feeling an indescribable peace take over his being. But when he opened his eyes again, Padre Pio was no longer there, as if he had vanished in the wind, leaving only his teaching forever marked on the young man's heart. That moment would stay with him for the rest of his life, as a sign that God was still at work in the world, and that true faith was lived through love for one's neighbor.